Today is the day of Gimmel Tamuz. It's the anniversary of the Rebbe's passing 31 years ago. The Rebbe, who was the spiritual leader of our generation. It's a very, very difficult time for us to reflect on all that we've lost, but there's a very powerful message that the Rebbe taught us that gives us strength, courage, and hope for a brighter Jewish tomorrow, despite the loss that we've all endured. And I'd like to share with you this message in light of this extraordinary location in which I'm in right now. I'm right here on a boat on the Ionian Sea. That is the ocean just south or between Greece and Italy, an ocean that you might not have heard of, but it's all part of the Mediterranean Sea. And it's right here in these gorgeous sapphire blue waters of the Ionian Sea that Jewish history tells a story that is, on the one hand, extraordinarily tragic, but at the same time, transformational, a story that changed the course of Jewish history. It happened exactly 1,035 years ago, right here in the waters of the Ionian Sea. What happened was that four great rabbis of that time, who lived in Bari, Italy, were traveling to a rabbinical conference in Sfax, Tunisia. Now, Bari, Italy is on the east coast of Italy, and you have to go around the boot of Italy in order to get to Tunisia. Really, as the crow flies, Bari to Sfax, Tunisia is straight through Sicily, but you have to go through the Ionian Sea in order to get here. These four rabbis, Rabbi Shmaryahu, Rabbi Chushiel, Rabbi Moshe, and his son Rabbi Chanoch, were the four great rabbis who were on this boat that was tragically taken captive by pirates 1,035 years ago in the year 990 CE. These four rabbis were taken captive, and they refused to identify themselves because they knew that the purpose of being taken captive was unlike today with Hamas, which is for political reasons, political leverage. Rather, it was for financial gain. So they knew that if they would identify themselves as Jews or as great rabbis, they obviously were known as Jews, but if they would identify themselves as important rabbis, then their price would astronomically rise. So they just kept themselves quiet. They did not identify who they were. And so it was that the pirates sold these four rabbis to three different Jewish communities. Rabbi Shmaryahu was sold to the Jewish community of Fustat, also known as Cairo. Rabbi Chushiel was sold to the Jewish community of Karwan, which is not far from Sfax in Tunisia. And the last two, Rabbi Moshe and his son Rabbi Chanoch, was sold to the Jewish community of Cordoba. Now, what was so transformational about this event is that until this time, remember, this is 990 CE, at the end of the first millennium CE. Until this time, the center of Jewish life was based in Iraq. Then it was called Babylon. What previously had happened was that the center of Jewish life was in the land of Israel. That was in the time, until the time of the Romans, during the time of Rabbi Yehuda, the prince, who made the executive decision in the first century CE. He made the executive decision of writing down the oral Torah, the Torah Shebaal Peh, writing it down as a written document, which became known as the Mishnah. The sages at that time were known as the Tanaim. These were the sages of the land of Israel who authored the Mishnah. They took the oral Torah and they wrote it down. That's called the Mishnah. Then in the first, second, and even third centuries, until Roman oppression in Israel became impossible and unbearable, Jewish life was centered in Israel. But once the Romans made life so difficult for the Jews, the center of Jewish life moved to Babylon, which is where the Talmud was written. And the sages who wrote the Talmud were no longer known as Tanaim, they were known as Amoraim. The sages of Babylon who wrote the Talmud down, this was the explanation of the written Mishnah, of the written version of the oral Torah. These sages were the center of Jewish life in Babylon until the end of the 5th century CE, which is when the Talmud was concluded. But from that time, from the end of the 5th century until the end of the first millennium, 400-500 years, the center of Jewish life was based in Iraq, was based in Babylon. So though there were already Jews living around the Mediterranean basin, the center of Jewish life was in Babylon. Imagine that. Imagine having a problem with Jewish law, and you needed to send a letter from Italy or from Tunisia or from Algeria, Libya, or maybe Spain, all the way to Iraq to get your answer. This could take weeks or months. It was difficult. It was inconvenient at best. It was unbearable at worst. But once these four rabbis were taken captive, and by divine providence, they were placed in four different communities: Rabbi Shmaryahu in Cairo, Rabbi Hushiel in Kairouan in Tunisia, and Rabbi Moshe and his son Rabbi Hanoch in Cordoba, Spain. They became the lighthouses of their various Jewish communities. From this point on, from the point of the four pirates being capturing the four, sorry, from the point of the pirates capturing the four rabbis, it was then that Jewish life evolved from the era of what was then known as the Gaonim. Again, the Tanaim were the authors of the Mishnah. The Amoraim were the authors of the Gemara, the explanation of the Mishnah. But once the Talmud was sealed, it was called the era of the Gaonim, which means the geniuses of Babylon who dominate the Jewish life and leadership. But once these four rabbis were sent to live in these four different countries around the Mediterranean basin, they now served as lighthouses within their local Jewish communities, and no more did the Jews of the Mediterranean basin need to turn to Iraq, Babylon for spiritual guidance and leadership. Now they had their own in-house rabbinic sages, and this marked the transition from the Gaonim, the geniuses, to the Rishonim, who were known as the early sages. The early sages, by the way, lasted about 500 years, till about 500 years ago, when we transitioned from the Rishonim to the Acharonim, the last sages, which is what we are today in the past 500 years. But it was right here in the Ionian Sea where this happened. And the story was even more tragic than I've said it, because when I mentioned to you before that the pirates captured the four rabbis, there was actually, one of them was married. Rabbi Moshe was married to the mother of Rabbi Hanoch. And one of the pirates, or the pirate captain, wanted to violate this beautiful woman. And what she did was, in order to protect herself from being violated, she jumped overboard into these gorgeous waters. They're absolutely gorgeous. The waters of the Ionian Sea between Greece and Italy, taking her life in order to make sure that she would not be violated as a married woman by this evil pirate. I sit here as I meditate and reflect on this precious life lost 1,035 years ago. A life that chose values over being violated. A person who, a soul so beautiful, so devoted, so dedicated to what she believed in, that she was willing to make the ultimate sacrifice in order to stand up for what she believed in. This story is so tragic, and it's painful for me to think of what went on in these Ionian waters. But within the story lies the secret of divine justice. As human beings, it's very difficult for us to understand divine justice, to understand how God operates. But God tells us in the Torah that things won't necessarily be good. It's not going to be easy. But in the end, everything will work out. The way that Hasidus explains it is that God will give us a period of darkness before we experience the sunrise. Just like a teacher who's preparing to teach something profound to a student will need to go silent for a while as he reflects inwardly, deeply, before being able to share the wisdom, the idea, the brilliance with the student on his level. So too, God will turn away from us, making it seem dark, lonely, and fearful, before he gives us something extraordinarily special and great. And that's why when you look at the story of Jewish history, greatness and goodness was always preceded by darkness and loneliness, spiritual darkness and spiritual isolation. If you look at your own life, I challenge you to consider. Look at your own life and think about the greatest moments of your life, the most joyous moments of your life. And think about how they might have been preceded by eras or periods of fearfulness, of loneliness, of competition, of struggle, of maybe medical struggle, maybe financial struggle. Before we can experience the lights, we must first endure the darkness. Night comes before day. This is a major theme of the Parsha of Korach, which we read this past Shabbos, where Korach comes in and he says, everybody's equal. He rebels against Moses. There should be no discrepancies between people, no classes, no hierarchy. We are all holy. We all stood before God at Mount Sinai, where Moses responds to him and he says, I'm sorry, sir, but God is the one that instituted the hierarchy. God is the one that instituted the division, the classes between people. And he says, just like morning and night were divided by God, so too Kohen, Levi, Israelites were the different classes of Jews that were set about by God and not by me. Whereas Moses was accused by Korach of nepotism and inventing the religion and the rules of the religion, Moses was saying, listen, God is going to prove it, that he's the one that chose us. And that's what led to the very unusual death that Korach and his followers experienced, where the hand of God was essentially revealed. In the story of the four rabbis as well, captured by the pirates, we see a transformation of Jewish history. We see the evolution of Jewish history, where Torah was almost forgotten due to the persecution of the Jewish people all over the world, wherever they were based. But it was the tragedy of the four rabbis being taken captive. It was the tragedy of the Rebbe who flung herself into these waters that actually led to the rebirth of Torah study across the Jewish world. It was the darkness that led to the light. And if you think about it, just after the destruction of our temple, the first temple, we saw the birth of the Mishnah. After the destruction of the second temple, we saw the birth of the Talmud. After the massacres of the Khmelnytsky pogroms of Ukraine in 1648 and 1649, we saw the rise of Hasidus, the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov and other sages, and other mystical sages. And after the Holocaust, we saw the rise of the Jewish people returning to their homelands, because after night always comes day. We have experienced the spiritual darkness 31 years ago in this day of Gimmul Tamuz, on the third day of Tamuz, when the Rebbe was taken away from us in a physical sense. We're no longer are we able to see our spiritual leader, the Moses of our generation, with eyes of flesh and blood. We're living in a time where we are groping in the spiritual darkness, but we don't know. We're not sure where to go, where to turn to, because we feel like our leader, our teacher, was taken away from us. But in reality, when you look back at the story, you realize that Chabad has only exponentially flourished since the Rebbe's passing. Whilst the Rebbe was extremely impactful in world Jewry in his lifetime, it was far, far greater impact that the Rebbe had on world Jewry after he passed, even before much compared to before his passing. Whereas there were many, many Chabad houses before the Rebbe passed away, the amount of Chabad houses that launched all over the world after the Rebbe's passing were far, far times greater, many times more than the Chabad houses that were before the Rebbe passed away. Because indeed, it was the darkness that led to greater light. And this is a very powerful message, which I wanted to share with you today on the special day of Gimmel Tammuz, to remember the workings of divine justice. We don't understand and we don't always agree, but at least we can know that the way that God treats us is giving us darkness in order to give us a greater light to follow. If we can just remember this principle, we will be able to ease our anxieties and to soften our fears. If we can only remember that everything will be good in the end. If it's not good, it means it's not the end.